Every pattern you repeat or every choice you can't explain and every version of yourself you keep returning to has a blueprint. Welcome to the Echo Principle, where we map the unseen architecture of human behavior. If you think carefully, you belong here, so drop a like and make sure to subscribe to our channel. It started with a question that a 15-year-old asked in a history class in California in 1967. The question was simple. How did it happen? How did ordinary German citizens, educated people, people with families and neighbors and daily lives, allow the Nazi regime to do what it did? How did they participate? How did they look away? How did they convince themselves that what they were watching was either acceptable or inevitable? Ron Jones was the history teacher, and he did not have a satisfying answer. He could explain the economics of post-war Germany. He could describe the political conditions. He could walk through the historical timeline with precision. But the question the student was really asking was not a historical one. It was a psychological one. And Jones knew that no lecture, however well constructed, was going to answer it honestly. So he decided to demonstrate it instead. What happened over the next 5 days in that classroom at Cubley High School in Palo Alto has been studied, debated, dramatized, and cited in psychology courses for over 50 years. Not because it was conducted with scientific rigor, it wasn't. Not because its findings can be cleanly replicated in a controlled environment. But because it produced something that pure laboratory research rarely produces. An unscripted, real-time demonstration of exactly how quickly a group of ordinary, educated, well-intentioned young people can be transformed into the thing they were studying. Jones called it the third wave. And by the time it ended, he was genuinely frightened by what he had created. Monday was about discipline. Jones walked into class and without explanation began demanding that students sit differently. Feet flat on the floor. Hands flat on the desk. Back straight. He spoke in short, precise sentences and expected immediate responses. Students who answered questions had to stand beside their desks to do so. They had to preface their answers with the words "Mr. Jones." The class went along with it. Not reluctantly. With something closer to enthusiasm. Jones later described his surprise at how quickly the posture change affected the atmosphere in the room. Students who were usually distracted became focused. The quality of responses improved. The pace of the class accelerated. He asked a question and 30 hands went up simultaneously. He later wrote that he felt a strange exhilaration watching it happen. That the discipline created a kind of collective energy that was genuinely exciting to be inside. And that the students felt it too. This is the first mechanism worth noting carefully. The appeal of discipline is not just about external compliance. It produces an internal experience that feels meaningful. The body in a disciplined posture generates different neurochemistry than the body in a relaxed one. Attention sharpens. The sense of purpose increases. And that internal experience, that feeling of being part of something focused and serious and unified, becomes associated with the structure that produced it. By the end of Monday, Jones had given the movement its motto. Strength through discipline. And the students had adopted it without being asked to believe in it. They had simply felt it. Tuesday was about community. Jones told the class they were part of a movement. That what they were doing was not just a classroom exercise but the foundation of something larger. He created a salute. A curved hand brought to the chest, mimicking a wave. The third wave salute. Students were instructed to use it when greeting each other, inside and outside the classroom. The motto expanded. Strength through discipline. Strength through community. And then something happened that Jones had not planned for. Students who were not in his class began showing up. Word had spread through the school. Other students wanted to be part of whatever was happening in room 16. By the end of Tuesday, the class had grown and the salute was being exchanged in hallways between students who had never met in the formal structure of the experiment. This is the second mechanism. Belonging. The salute was not just a gesture. It was a recognition signal. A way of identifying who was inside the group and who was outside it. And the experience of exchanging it, of being recognized by a stranger as a fellow member of something, activated the same belonging circuitry that human beings have been running on for hundreds of thousands of years. The tribal brain does not ask what am I belonging to before it generates the warmth of recognition. It generates the warmth first. The justification comes later. Or it doesn't come at all, and that turns out not to matter. Wednesday was when Jones began to understand that something had shifted beyond his control. He issued membership cards. Each student received a card and 3 students received cards with a red X marked on them. Those 3 were quietly told that they were responsible for reporting any member who did not fully embrace the principles of the movement. They were not asked to spy. They were given a role within the structure. A purpose. A reason to pay close attention. By the end of Wednesday, Jones had received reports from more than 20 students who were not the designated 3. Students who had not been assigned any reporting role had taken it upon themselves to inform on classmates who were expressing doubt, making jokes about the movement, or failing to use the salute correctly. They were not doing this because they were told to. They were doing it because they had internalized the movement's logic to the point where protecting it felt like their own genuine interest. The group's values had become their values. The group's enemies had become their enemies. The boundary between performing membership and being a member had dissolved. This is the third mechanism and the most dangerous one. Identity fusion. The point at which the individual's sense of self becomes sufficiently entangled with the group's identity that actions taken on behalf of the group no longer feel like compliance. They feel like self-expression. Jones later said that Wednesday was the day the experiment stopped feeling like a lesson and started feeling like something else entirely. Something he did not yet have a word for, but that he recognized, viscerally, as what he had set out to demonstrate. By Thursday, the movement had 200 members. It had spread to other classes, other teachers, other grade levels. Students were recruiting actively. A junior had been disciplined by an older third-wave member for failing to comply with movement standards. A student journalist was considering running a story critical of the movement and received enough pressure from fellow students that they dropped it. Jones was receiving attention from administrators who had heard something unusual was happening in his classroom. He gave them a version of the explanation that minimized what was actually occurring. He was not ready to stop. On Thursday, he told the students that the third wave was not a classroom experiment. It was a national movement. That there were classrooms across the country doing exactly what they were doing. That on Friday there would be a televised announcement from the movement's national leader, confirming its existence and revealing its next phase. The students believed him. Completely. Not because they were naive or unusually credulous. Because by Thursday they wanted it to be true. They had invested enough of their identity in the movement that its reality had become necessary to them. The desire for the thing to be real had become indistinguishable from the belief that it was. This is the fourth mechanism. Sunk cost psychology applied to ideology. Once a person has publicly performed commitment to a belief, the psychological cost of abandoning that belief becomes attached to the cost of admitting the performance was misplaced. And that combined cost is often higher than the person is willing to pay. Friday. 200 students packed into the auditorium. Some had skipped other classes to be there. Some had brought friends who were not enrolled at the school. They sat in disciplined rows, backs straight, waiting for the television screen at the front of the room to reveal the national leader of the movement they had spent a week building their identity around. Jones stood at the front and let the silence hold for longer than was comfortable. Then he turned on the screen. It was blank. There was no national movement. There was no leader. There was no televised announcement. There was nothing. Jones told them what they had been doing. He told them what they had become in 5 days. He showed them photographs of Nazi rallies and drew the direct comparison. He told them that they had demonstrated, with their own behavior, over one school week, the exact thing they had been unable to understand from the history books. The room was silent in a way that Jones described as different from ordinary quiet. Several students were crying. Some simply sat and stared at the blank screen. One student who had been among the most committed members left the room without speaking and did not return that day. Jones ended the experiment. But he could not end what it had produced in the people who had lived it. Many of the students did not want to talk about it for years afterward. Some never did. Because what the third wave had shown them was not something comfortable about German citizens in the 1930s. It was something deeply uncomfortable about themselves. Let us take the mechanisms apart properly now, because the story is only useful if we understand precisely what it is demonstrating. The first element is the speed. 5 days. Not 5 years of propaganda. Not a lifetime of cultural conditioning. 5 days with a moderately charismatic teacher in a public school classroom. The research on conformity and group identity formation has consistently found that the timeline for meaningful identity capture by a group structure is far shorter than most people expect. The famous Robbers Cave experiment produced fierce intergroup hostility between two groups of boys within days of their formation. Muzafer Sherif's research demonstrated that group identity and its attendant psychology, in-group favoritism, out-group hostility, the willingness to disadvantage non-members, emerges with a speed that suggests it is not a learned behavior overlaid on neutral human nature. It is the default. The second element is the profile of the participants. These were not children from backgrounds of deprivation or instability. They were students at a well-resourced school in one of the most educated communities in California. Several of them were actively studying the conditions that produce authoritarianism at the same time that they were demonstrating those conditions. The knowledge did not protect them. It did not even slow the process down. This is what makes the third wave more than an interesting historical anecdote. It is a controlled demonstration of the inadequacy of the liberal assumption that education is a sufficient defense against authoritarian psychology. It is not. Education tells you about the phenomenon. It does not inoculate you against experiencing it. There is a direct line from the third wave to Stanley Milgram's obedience research, which we covered in an earlier episode, and it is worth drawing explicitly. Milgram showed that 65% of ordinary people would continue delivering what they believed were potentially lethal electric shocks when an authority figure in a lab coat told them to continue. The mechanism was the agentic state. The transfer of moral responsibility upward to the authority, leaving the individual feeling like an instrument of someone else's will rather than an autonomous agent making their own choices. What the third wave demonstrates is the horizontal version of the same mechanism. It is not just authority figures above us that can produce this transfer. Peer groups beside us can do it equally effectively. When identity is fused with group membership, the group becomes the moral authority. And actions taken in service of the group carry the same transfer of individual responsibility that Milgram observed in the vertical hierarchy. The individual student who reported a classmate for insufficient commitment to the movement was not a different kind of person from the Milgram participant who kept pressing the lever. They were running the same psychological program. The same transfer. The same dissolution of individual moral agency into the structure they had been absorbed by. The difference is that the third wave participants were not in a laboratory. They were in a school. They had chosen to join. They had experienced the belonging and the discipline and the sense of purpose as genuinely their own, which made the absorption more complete and the individual moral agency harder to locate. The contemporary relevance of the third wave is not subtle, and it would be dishonest to avoid it. The Internet has created conditions for identity capture by group structures that are in some respects more efficient than anything Ron Jones deployed in Room 16. The mechanisms are identical. The recognition signal, the in-group marker that tells you who belongs and who does not. The reporting function, the social pressure applied to members who express insufficient commitment. The escalating investment of identity that makes the cost of leaving the group continuously higher. The manufactured sense of participating in something larger and more significant than ordinary life. These dynamics do not belong to any single political position or ideological orientation. They have been documented across the full spectrum of online communities. The research on online radicalization consistently finds that the initial draw is almost never the ideology. It is the belonging, the sense of recognition, the warmth of being seen by people who share your framework. The ideology comes later, carried in on the back of an identity that has already been formed. This is precisely what Jones observed on Tuesday when the salute began being exchanged in hallways between people who had never met. The gesture came before the belief. The belonging came before the commitment. And once the belonging was established, the commitment followed because the alternative was losing the belonging. Jones's students were not drawn into the third wave by its ideas. They barely had time to develop ideas in 5 days. They were drawn in by the experience of being part of something, and the ideas attached themselves to that experience as justification. Ron Jones has given interviews about the third wave for decades. He has said different things in different conversations about how he feels about what he did. There is guilt in many of the accounts. A sense that he took something further than he should have, and that the students who were most committed paid a psychological price for the experience that he did not fully anticipate. But there is also something else in his accounts. A kind of recurring amazement. Not at what the students did. At how little it took. At how minimal the architecture of the third wave actually was. A posture. A motto. A salute. A card. A role. A promise of something larger. That was all it took to produce in 200 educated teenagers the behavioral profile that historians spend careers trying to explain in the context of some of the most catastrophic events of the 20th century. The lesson that Jones intended to teach was about Nazi Germany. The lesson that the third wave actually delivers is both broader and more personal. It is not about a specific regime or a specific era or a specific set of conditions. It is about the human being, about the depth of the need for belonging, about the speed with which identity can be captured by a structure that meets that need. about the invisibility of the process from the inside. The students sitting in that auditorium on Friday did not feel like they had been manipulated. They felt like they had been part of something real, something meaningful, something that had given them a clarity of purpose and a sense of connection that ordinary school life had not provided. That feeling was genuine, and it had been used to demonstrate something that none of them wanted to be true about themselves. Here is where it lands. The third wave is not a story about what happens to other people in extreme circumstances. It is a story about what happens to ordinary people in mild ones. About the vulnerability that lives inside the completely normal human need to belong to something, to matter to a group, to have a role in a structure that feels larger than individual life. That vulnerability is not a weakness to be eliminated. It is the same architecture that makes genuine community possible. The same need that, when met by something genuinely good, produces loyalty, sacrifice, collective achievement, the kind of sustained cooperation that built everything worth building in human history. The question is never whether that architecture is present. It always is. The question is what is being built on top of it, and whether you are in a position to evaluate that question honestly while the belonging is actively being provided. Because Jones's students could not. Not while they were inside it. The evaluation only became possible on Friday, when the blank screen forced it. And even then, some of them left the room without speaking. Because the honest evaluation of what you have been part of, when that evaluation requires acknowledging that your own psychology was the instrument, is one of the hardest things a person can be asked to do. Ron Jones gave his students something that most people never receive. Not a comfortable lesson about the past. A precise, personal, embodied understanding of how it is possible. And the understanding only came at the cost of first demonstrating that it was possible with them. That is not a small thing to give a person, even if they did not thank him for it. This has been the Echo Principle. Drop a like if you enjoyed and make sure to subscribe.